as we bring sort of this bring this conversation to a close about the basic use of the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's some principles that have been outlined by Hayes and Green in their book, The Use of the Old Testament and the New, or The Use of the Old Testament by New Testament Writers. There's sort of 7 basic principles that are pretty helpful just to think about, some more than others. Now again, if you can't see it too well, that's okay. The first basic question is this. What Old Testament texts are cited or alluded to in this New Testament passage? Is there a pattern that characterizes this New Testament writer's choice of Old Testament references? Patterns may emerge in both the Old Testament context and the New Testament context, especially when more than one text is quoted or alluded to. Now, a good example of this, in terms of patterns and things like that, is to go, I won't do it now, but you can go do it, is to go look at Matthew chapters 1 through 4, where there's a definite pattern of quotations, all of which are to show exactly what is happening there with the birth of Jesus. Again, I wouldn't hear your fingers flying. I can make this available if you want it. You don't have to try to write it. Just sit back and enjoy yourselves. All right. I know it's late in the class to make a joke like that. Anyway, so that's an example. I mean, this is, another example would be, in places like Romans 9 through 11, things like that. And this is just really just a careful study of both the context of the New and the context in the Old. But it's just a general principle. Does this text of the New Testament citation correspond exactly to any known textual tradition of the Old Testament? Does it follow the Masoretic text or the Septuagint, or neither? Does the quote appear to be modified? If so, does there appear to be any evident reasons for this modification? And in modification, don't read that as don't read that as any kind of nefarious thing. All this is saying is carefully analyze the sort of quote that you're looking at, and if it doesn't appear exactly, try to discern why. I mean, I'll just give you a simple example of this happening in real life. When the first time I ever led a Bible study in the book of Hebrews, I wasn't super familiar with something called the LXX, the Septuagint. And I just had my English Bible. I looked at quotes in the book of Hebrews. I went back to find them in the Old Testament, and what did I find? They weren't quite what I was reading in the New Testament. Because it's the difference between the Old Testament translation based on the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text, and of course the writer of the Hebrews citing the Septuagint. And so anyway, this is just it's just a very sort of common sense step and thing to think about. And by the way, it can be something really, really helpful to be able to point out to people as they are learning, as you're teaching people how to study the Bible and what to look for. And this is one of those basic, why is this happening in my Bible questions. And it's good to be able to show people what's happening and why. Now, this is not always a factor. It is sometimes, but I wouldn't make too much out of it. What's the original context of the passage in the Old Testament setting? Does the writer's interpretation appear to reflect a recognition of that setting? In other words, like this is what we did with Psalm 22:1 from Matthew. Does there appear to be a recognition? Does there appear to be a recognition of the larger context of the Old Testament quote? That's all. That's all that means. It's a common sense sort of thing. 4. What, if anything, can be learned about traditions of interpretations in ancient Jewish sources outside the New Testament, and which are often contrary? The New Testament, which is often contrary to the traditions. Now, this is clearly not always significant, and I'm not suggesting that every time you sit down to read the Bible that you first have to have mastered all the Jewish literature. Okay? I want you to hear me really clearly. In some contexts, doing certain kinds of work, this is more important than other contexts doing other kinds of work. But I'll just give you an example. In Romans 4, 1 through 8, right, Abraham is an example of justification of the ungodly. That's what Paul says, right? He holds, it's Abraham who believes in he believes in God who justifies the ungodly, and makes alive what's dead. But it's really pretty clear the word ungodly is connected to Abraham in Romans 4, 1 to 8. Not godly, and not that there's something sort of in his past that God is validating or rewarding when Abraham was justified by faith. Right? Otherwise, the word ungodly being there doesn't make any sense. Now, in a Jewish tradition, for instance, in the Jewish book of Jubilees, this is in chapter 12, Abraham's prior faithfulness is manifested by the fact that in that book of Jubilees, he burns all the idols in his father's house before God calls him. Well, again, this doesn't fit what Paul is saying, right? But how well that was known, I don't know. But in another Jewish piece of Jewish literature called the Apocalypse of Abraham, it has a description, this is in chapter 7 of that work. It describes Abraham's dissatisfaction with the gods of his land, the gods of his father, and it results in him asking the true God to reveal himself to him. And again, this is a pretty current or a pretty contemporary Jewish tradition around the time that Paul is writing. Right? So it could be that Romans 4, 1 to 8, in addition to being Paul sort of backing his way through redemptive history, when he says what we say about our father Abraham, it could be that he is reacting to these Jewish traditions that try to say, Abraham was really already on board before Genesis 12, which I think Paul negates that idea, again, by using the word ungodly in the same context. Okay? And this gets back to a question. A question I can't remember when it was. A question like this came up earlier in the class, and this is one of those times where I said, "Well, we'll wait and talk about that later." But both the context of Romans and the context of Genesis leads me to believe that in no way is God recognizing, something about Abraham's actions or his prior commitment to God or searching for God or anything else when he calls him at Haran. But again, that's one of the easier ones to see. Number 5, how does the Old Testament passage function in the argument or narrative of the New Testament writers? In other words, why is the writer using this text? All right, Mark 4:12, you see the use of Isaiah 6:10. There where you have sort of a commonality between Isaiah's ministry that we looked at the other day in Isaiah 6 and Jesus' ministry, and then an explanation taken from Isaiah of why Jesus teaches in parables. Right? So I think there you have sort of a parallel between the sort of ministry that Isaiah was doing, the way it's described in Isaiah 6, and the kind of ministry that Jesus is doing. Right? And that's where you get this quote from Isaiah 6, about to use, been given to know the mystery of the kingdom of God, but to those who are outside, these things are spoken in parables, so that, and then you get Isaiah 6. Are there intertextual clues that help us interpret the text in the New Testament? An example of this would be the thing I did from James 4, James 4, you murder each other, Exodus 20, murder, Matthew 5 in the middle between them, where it defines, that hatred is murder. I think James's interpretation or definition of murder is informed by the teaching of Jesus. And then finally, how does this writer's use of the Old Testament text, after all or some of the above questions have been answered, how does it fit into a larger New Testament perspective? In other words, particularly in terms of the text being fulfilled in Christ and the church. In other words, now having sort of gone through one or a number of these steps, the final step, you say, is how does this fit into the big picture of the revelation of God in Christ in the New Testament? Right? So again, these are just basic steps. And we could go through some examples. I don't think that we will right now. An interesting cluster of texts to consider just for your own study would be, say, 1 Peter 2:9, and his use of chosen people, priesthood, holy nation, and a people for God's own possession. All Old Testament quotes where he immediately attaches it to people living in the New Covenant. You could go through. I mean, that's an interesting exercise to go to that text in 1 Peter chapter 2 and sort of work your way through these steps. Not all of them, but some of them, and you'll see patterns, and you'll see Peter's application. Of these in general. As I said the other day, you have all these texts that are clearly texts about people living in the Old Covenant, in the Mosaic Covenant, and Peter immediately applies them without explanation, without blinking, to the church, which includes, of course, both Jews and Gentiles. Okay? Well, let's talk finally a little bit about typology. Here's a typical definition of typology. A type is any biblical event, person, or institution which serves as an example or pattern for other biblical events, persons, or institutions. Typology is the study of types and the historical and theological correspondences between them. The basis of typology is God's consistent activity in the experience of His chosen people. It's important that we understand and think about typology in terms of God's redemptive actions and the responses of His people. In other words, typology is not simply about finding sort of some neat things that appear here in the Old Testament and now here they are in the New Testament. We need to think of typology in terms of God's redemption of His people and God's relationship with His people. It's not just, here's a tree and there's a tree. Or here's a rock and there's a rock. Or here's a guy who acted this way, now here's another guy who acts this way in the New Testament. Typology is not just sort of random observations. I think I gave an example like this the other day. Jeremiah is not a type of Paul simply because, like Paul, he was arrested for carrying out his job as speaking for God. I don't think he is. Paul's in that line of people who get persecuted and arrested for speaking the word of God. But I don't think Jeremiah there is meant to be sort of a type pointing towards Paul. Now, what about Numbers 2:1-9? Where the men of Judah, you remember what's happening in Numbers 2:1-9? This is how they camp around the tabernacle, right? The men from Judah are commanded to camp on the outer ring of the tribes of Israel, facing sunrise, and they're to be the first to set out and fight. Now, is that pointing typologically towards Christ? The fact that the tribe of Judah is given this position where they are in the lead, they're the ones where they're facing where the sun comes up, they're in the lead, they're also supposed to go out, they're in the lead heading, what's that direction? East, and they're the first to go out in battle. Is there a typological connection to Christ in that text? You're waiting for me to give you the answer, but I'm asking you a question. Or is it just, this is just the way they lined up? Well, I don't think that has to be typology. But at the same time, I do think that there is a pattern being established of the prominence of Judah. which you don't have to hunt and peck for in the Bible. It's already been promised back in Genesis. But that doesn't make that necessarily a type of Jesus as the author and finisher of our salvation or something like that. And so, but I do think that that fits a pattern that's already established back in Genesis, right, when you have the Genesis 38, and then the blessing to Judah, who's going to rule and reign. We've talked about this many times. I think what you have here is you have another example in the trajectory of the prominence of Judah. I mean, I think to deny that is just, I don't understand why anybody would. I mean, it can be denied, but I don't understand. I don't understand the point of denying that or why somebody would deny it. But I could see and would agree with somebody who says, well, that's not really that doesn't make Judah a type in this sort of sense in this text. Though I think it's probably closer. There's some examples of types, like say Romans 5:14. Right, let's look at that one. I mean, this is a clear one where somebody is actually called a type. And let's see what's going on with that text. Nevertheless, one more time. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam until Moses, even over those who had not sinned in the likeness of the offense of Adam, who is a type of him who was to come. Okay, fair enough. What helps us? I mean, when Paul says who's a type of the one to come, what's that have to do with the interpretation of this verse? I think Paul informs us explicitly that Adam served as a type pointing to Jesus in the redemptive flow of the Bible, and it serves an incredibly important point in this verse because of what Paul's arguing. Paul's arguing that death reigned, right, from Adam, who was given a specific known command to follow, and then you have Moses, who gives the law, obviously, specific known commands to follow. In the meantime, death reigned. In other words, death and sin still in the world. And those who didn't sin in the likeness of Adam's sin, in other words, sin against a known stated command. Right? Is everybody on board before I go further? Because this is going to get complicated really quick. Okay? So, they didn't sin in the likeness of Adam's transgression being sin in face of a known command, yet they died. So we know that sin and death still in the world. But then when he puts in, who is a type of him who was to come, I think what that does then is then puts Jesus in the place of Adam in terms of obeying known specific commands of God. So he stands as a second Adam. And I think that's why Paul makes the effort of pointing out that he is a type of the one to come. So that's a text about Jesus' positive obedience as one who, as he says, Jesus himself said, I always do what's pleasing to my Father. I came down from heaven not to do my will, but the will of him who sent me. No one takes it from me, I lay it down of my own accord. This command I received from my Father, right? There's Jesus saying what? I am both passively submitting to my Father's command, and I'm actively accomplishing it. Nobody takes it from me, I lay it down of my own accord. And why am I doing this? Because I received the command from my Father. So anyway, that's tied to that. Another place in Hebrews 9:24, the holy place is identified as a copy of the true holy place into which Christ entered. Right? In this example, the type doesn't point just forward, it points upward to a heavenly reality. That, of course, then is revealed in the New Testament. Now, the transitory or temporary nature of those images and shadows were not first revealed in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament. Like in Psalm 46, which is interpreting the sacrifices typologically, looking forward to the one who does come, when it says, I delight to do your will, O God, the law is within my heart. And so anyway, all I'm saying is there's another example, but that's a clearer one. Was that a question? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. The question is about people who get so specific in terms of the plans of the tabernacle that even down to the boards, all the boards are specific pointers, typological pointers towards Jesus. Let me say this first. First and foremost, I appreciate all the desire that people have to delve in deeply into the Old Testament to see how it's pointing to Jesus, how it's connected to God's big plan of salvation, and that's in every way commendable. However, at certain points we have to stop and ask, is there reason, either by a verbal reason or a reason in terms of pattern or theme, that causes us to connect this to Jesus? You know what I mean? Other than something that just a vague analogy that we just make up. I think there has to be some kind of verbal, thematic, textual link between something in the Old Testament and Jesus. And so I think that's how we have to sort of evaluate these sort of claims of typology. Do you know? Can you think of an example of why they might say something like one of the boards in the? Yeah. Yeah, that's a great. I'm glad you brought that up. That's allegory, not typology. If you didn't hear it, the interpretation is this: that the boards, wood, are the. Help me again. It's the humanity of Christ. The outline gold is the deity of Jesus. Well, see, that's not typology. That's allegory. And I guess my problem with that is I don't see any verbal, either explicitly verbal, thematic, or textual, or even patterns. That's the other thing you look for. Like, are there patterns that connect something in the Old Testament to the New Testament? And I don't see any of that in the idea of overlaying the boards. It sort of sounds like somebody has thought about sort of it actually sounds like it might even be connected to a strange view of Christ's deity and humanity, of somehow you have his deity, you have his humanity, and then it's somehow encased by, it's weird. It's a weird Christology that I'm really uncomfortable with, but at that point they might say it's just an analogy. Right? But that seems to actually flow against the two natures, the orthodox view of the two natures of Jesus. But that'd be a good example of, where's the pattern? Where's the pattern established in the Old or in the New Testament that shows that Christ's two natures are spoken of in that sort of way? Right, so it has to be evaluated. I saw a hand, I think. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Well, I could go back. It might help. Here, let's listen to the definition. This is a pretty decent definition. A type is a biblical event, person, or institution which serves as an example or pattern for other biblical events, person, or institutions. It's to study the types and historical and theological correspondence. It's things that correspond redemptively, theologically, from the Old Testament to the New, or from here to there. And they correspond in terms of patterns, which can be thematic or verbal. There's any number of things we might add to that. And they're discernible and at least arguable on the basis of textual clues, textual patterns. However, looking at the wood that happens to be overlaid with gold and saying the wood stands for Jesus' body, the gold or Jesus' humanity, the gold stands for Jesus' deity, that's allegory. It's saying the wood is not the wood. The wood stands for this. It's sort of like it's like reading the tabernacle like Pilgrim's Progress. However, talking about the tabernacle and in the way it functioned and what was accomplished there, pointing forward to the sacrifice of Jesus, that's in the line of typology. Right? It was pointing, there's a pattern there, the existing pattern that you can show in the Bible that points forward and is fulfilled in Jesus. But there is no such thing, there is no corresponding or similar pattern between the wood and the gold. Does that?
So in typology, you're looking for the clues of the author. He's actually trying to make a point to show you that this represents something more.
Yeah, you're looking for... You're looking for corresponding patterns, which can be of various kinds. It's just, I know this was sort of an extreme example. It's just that, that example is troubling because the Christology is at least on the verge of being not orthodox. But I still get the point. It's just, there's nothing there that points me in that direction. It seems like to me that it's more likely that it's laid with gold because it's being used for the tabernacle, and then it fits the pattern of when you see gold and precious stones and silver in Revelation. It's all about it seems to me all about the kind of garden imagery and then the consummation imagery you have in Revelation.
Can it still become, even doing typology, become subjective?
Oh yeah.
I guess that's the difficult thing for me, is trying to get my head around this, is trying to make sure that I'm being faithful to the text, but at the same time, I don't want to be unfaithful to the representation of Christ in the Old Testament. So I guess I'm just trying to find rules to follow by doing this, so that I'm not out in left field on some interpretation when I'm teaching the Old Testament.
No, it can become. This is why I made a comment the other day. I don't know at what point. I made a comment the other day that one of the things we could be in danger of these days is sort of typology seeming to take the place of careful exegesis. Because we look at typology and think, oh, it's just a matter of finding something here, and this sort of looks like it there, whether or not I'm directed in that place. And then we can really sanctify it by saying things like, well, I'm just trying to think God's thoughts after him. Right? Which then is the unsaleable argument for, now you're arguing with God, not me. And so, no, we have to be extraordinarily careful. We have to be extraordinarily careful. And the typology is not the place to start. Typology is not the place to begin. And there's a good reason why I've left it all the way to the end of the class, and this is just a bare introduction to it. But there's a good reason why this is the very last thing we talk about in hermeneutics. Because a good understanding of how typology works assumes a knowledge of virtually everything that we've talked about already up to this point. A working knowledge of it. So that then it can be applied. And then that's how you can discern, is there a literary pattern of some kind here? Well, you can't really discern that until you've learned how to read that particular kind of literature. Both old and new, to be able to discern the pattern. Now, but it's not my view. It's not my view that every single type has to be named as such in the Bible. Here's an example. This one gets talked about quite a bit, and that is Joshua's renewing of the covenant. In Joshua 1, Joshua 3. I think it's fair to say that an original reader would have understood Joshua symbolically standing in the place of Moses. I don't think that's a stretch. That Joshua's actions look similar to, say, Deuteronomy 31 or something like that. So there's a link. There's a link between Moses and then Joshua. And then it's possible to view Joshua in his work of covenant faithfulness and conquest as corresponding to the work of Christ, who was both faithful to God, Hebrews 5:8, John 5:36, and defeated the enemies of God and God's people on the cross, Colossians 2:15. Right? So there's a there's a pattern there that can at least be discussed. I'm not asserting that one right now. I'm just saying there's an example of where you have a developing biblical pattern. Right? You have developing biblical pattern of covenant, faithfulness to God, and Joshua as one who defeats the enemies of God. Right? Who stands in the place of Moses. So you have this line, Moses, then to Joshua, and then to Jesus. Now, whatever you may think of that, and whether it's valid or not, that'd be a good example. That'd be a good example of at least pointing towards. Now, once having done that, and cited these texts like Hebrews 5:8, John 5:36, Colossians 2:15, and then all the Joshua 1:3, Deuteronomy 31. Having cited these texts, now we have it on the table. Here's texts. Is there a pattern or not? And then we can decide on the basis of these texts and patterns. And you notice I'm not just pointing to cited texts. I'm also pointing to the pattern of Joshua. And what he did and what he accomplished as the leader of Israel, as the one who's who is faithful to the covenant maker that is God, and what he accomplishes in the land. So I'm pointing both to specific texts, but also to a pattern of action, behavior in the person of Joshua. Right? So again, that would be an example of a discussion of typology based on the types of things I was talking about. Okay? And again, I don't want to keep using this example. Again, in my view, it would be difficult to come up with similar patterns for sort of specific implements in, say, the tabernacle, every specific implement in the tabernacle pointing towards Jesus in some kind of way. When it seems like to me the whole thing in its totality is. I mean, take these sacrifices. It's sometimes argued, like in 1 Corinthians 5:21, that Jesus is a sin offering. And then some people will point out, well, no. The sin offerings didn't work exactly in this or that way. It's connected to a big discussion. But my view is that Jesus is a fulfillment, not in 1 Corinthians 5:21 points to the sin offering, but it's not a matter of Jesus being the fulfillment of that offering here, and this offering, and that offering. He's a fulfillment of the sacrificial system in its entirety. So he doesn't, the description in, say, 2 Corinthians 5:21, and not everybody views that as Jesus being a sin offering. I mean, I do, but not everybody does. That doesn't have to fit exactly, sort of one-to-one, any particular sacrifice in the Old Testament to be true. The whole pattern of sacrifice is fulfilled. Right. So, but again, there we're talking about things we can debate and discuss, and which, I mean, we can debate and discuss anything, I suppose, no matter how much proof we might have for it. So anyway, I know that's a short and not very satisfactory discussion of typology. It's really just to open the door for you. And the thing I would encourage you to do is to put it on hold. Now, I'm completely on board with it. There's one of our professors here, Dr. Hamilton, he's written lots of good articles that are typological, or based on typological interpretations, and also articles about doing typology. And I commend them to you. But I wouldn't make things like typology or intertextuality or intertextuality, I wouldn't put that on the front burner immediately. Because these are things that the success in pursuing these things are based on kind of fundamental practices of biblical interpretation sort of before you get to that step. Right? Because you got to build up to them. The problem is we want to start at the top and not really work our way down. And I do fear when I hear some just inklings of things in sermons, I'm not saying here, but in general, out in the world around us. When I hear sermons that are sounding typological, I start to think it sounds like we're moving further and further away from needing to have any kind of biblical warrant to call something a type or a correspondence or something like that. So anyway, just to sum up, there's no method of hermeneutics. and no one way of thinking about biblical interpretation. Understanding the big picture helps us keep all the pieces in perspective, but we have to remember that the big picture is constantly being filled in, and we have to remember that once you establish a big picture, it's easy to get locked in and think, I've got it. But you have to remember, when we talk about big picture issues, that's a synthesis of biblical teaching. And so when we construct a big picture of the Bible, we have to remember that structure, that big picture that we've constructed, is always subject to the text itself as well. Right? Our interpretations are always subject to the text. And we have to be careful, no matter how many things, how right it looks, how many things it looks like we've got, how clever or smart or whatever it is, we have to be willing to say, you know what, that's not really the way the Bible presents it. So we have to be careful. The big danger of this big picture perspective is that it sets up a paradigm that can quickly become less than biblical without realizing it. And that becomes the paradigm through which we judge everything. So we have to be careful. But we need to approach the Bible prayerfully. We need to approach the Bible as being the Word of God to us. Begin with the author's stated intent and get to the bottom of that first. That's always our first and foremost job. And then you start applying it through the genres of Scripture and how they're connected and how the rules of reading them. But through the whole thing, keep repeating this to yourself. Every time you sit down to do Bible reading, I'm taking this from Kierkegaard, whatever else you might think of Kierkegaard, this quote is good. Whatever else I think of him, this quote is still good. It is about me that it is written. It is to me that it is written. It is about me that it is written. It is to me that is written. And do that, now it's back to Vickers, do that by asking God to give you the grace to have an open heart and open mind to understand the Scriptures so that you can hear Him speaking to you. Right? Biblical interpretation, remember, begins with the submission of the interpreter to the authority of the Bible. That's where it has to begin. All right, blessings to you, and thank you for your attention and questions and interaction.